Stephen Dedalus is born into an Irish Catholic family during a period of significant political and religious upheaval in Ireland. His father, Simon Dedalus, is a faded gentleman of diminishing fortune, whose idealism has been tempered by financial decline and disappointment. His mother, Mary, is a devout Catholic woman devoted to her family and the Church's teachings and moral precepts. Young Stephen experiences childhood through impressionistic sensations and emotional reactions rather than logical comprehension or rational understanding. His earliest memories are fragmented and dreamlike, focusing on physical sensations, colors, and emotional atmospheres, rather than coherent narrative. Stephen is sent to Clongoweswood College, a prestigious Jesuit boarding school where he encounters rigorous religious education and physical discipline. At Clongowes, Stephen experiences both intellectual stimulation and psychological torment from older boys and the austere educational regime. He is pushed into a ditch by a bully named Wells, an incident that traumatizes him and creates lasting anxiety about physical vulnerability. Stephen becomes ill and is sent home to recover, experiencing tenderness from his mother and the comfort of familiar surroundings. Religious fear permeates his consciousness as Jesuit priests emphasize damnation, sin, and eternal punishment with terrifying vividness and psychological intensity. Stephen absorbs Catholic doctrine completely, becoming deeply pious and attempting to live according to strict moral and religious principles. At Belvedere College, Stephen excels academically and becomes recognized for his intellectual abilities and prowess in written composition. He begins to experience adolescent desires and attractions to girls, creating internal conflict between his religious devotion and emerging sexuality. Stephen attends a religious retreat where priests deliver sermons about hell and damnation with graphic descriptions and horrifying imagery. The sermons trigger profound psychological crisis. Stephen contemplates his own sins and the possibility of eternal punishment and suffering. He becomes consumed by guilt and fear, confessing minor infractions repeatedly and attempting to mortify his body through self. Stephen experiences intense religious fervor, contemplating becoming a priest and dedicating himself entirely to God's service and the Church's mission. However, his religious vocation gradually fades as he begins to recognize contradictions in Catholic doctrine and institutional hypocrisy. He questions whether the priests genuinely believe the doctrines they preach or merely perpetuate inherited traditions without authentic conviction. Stephen becomes aware of his own intellectual capacity to question authority and to think independently. Despite institutional pressure toward conformity, he attends University College Dublin, where his intellectual horizons expand beyond the narrow confines of religious indoctrination and control. At university, Stephen encounters modern philosophy, literature, and ideas that challenge his received Catholic worldview and inherited assumptions. He develops friendships with other students who share his intellectual curiosity and his growing skepticism toward established orthodoxies. Stephen begins to conceive of himself as an artist rather than as a devoted Catholic or a dutiful son of his declining family. He experiences intense attraction to a young woman named Icarus, projecting romantic and spiritual ideals onto her that exceed her actual person. When Icarus fails to match his imagined vision, Stephen experiences bitter disappointment and interprets her indifference as confirmation of his artistic isolation. His romantic idealization transforms into artistic aspiration as he begins to recognize his vocation as a writer and aesthetic thinker. Stephen reads contemporary literature and philosophy, encountering ideas about art, beauty, and individual freedom that profoundly influence his consciousness. He becomes fascinated by the notion that the artist must stand apart from society, observing and transforming ordinary experience into art. The concept of the artist as isolated observer and detached creator appeals to Stephen's emerging sense of himself as fundamentally different from others. Stephen attempts to articulate an aesthetic theory that emphasizes the artist's need for absolute freedom from moral, religious, and social constraints. He argues that true art transcends utilitarian purposes and moralistic intent, existing instead in pursuit of beauty and formal perfection. Stephen's family circumstances continue to deteriorate financially, creating constant anxiety about practical survival and economic security. His father's failures and decline trouble Stephen deeply, yet he feels unable to rescue his family from their downward trajectory. He experiences shame about his family's poverty and their reduced social status in the eyes of Dublin society and his peers. Yet Stephen simultaneously recognizes that his family's decline has freed him from certain conventional expectations and social obligations. His mother remains devout and disappointed in Stephen's abandonment of religious faith and his apparent rejection of family loyalty. The conflict between Stephen's intellectual independence and his mother's religious devotion creates ongoing tension within the family dynamic. Stephen recognizes that artistic freedom requires rejecting not only religious authority, but also familial obligation and social convention. He gradually distances himself from his mother, recognizing that her love, though genuine, cannot accommodate his autonomous individuation and growth. Stephen becomes increasingly alienated from Dublin society, which he perceives as provincial, intellectually restrictive, and morally hypocritical. He begins to view Dublin and Ireland as constricting forces that will prevent him from developing as an artist and free thinker. His decision to exile himself from Ireland becomes almost inevitable as he recognizes the irreconcilable conflict between artistic freedom and cultural conformity. Stephen encounters a mysterious religious woman at the seashore, who initially attracts him, but ultimately confirms his conviction that institutional spirituality is false. He experiences what he interprets as a mystical or transcendent moment at the beach, though the experience is ambiguous and psychologically complex. The moment seems to represent a kind of secular epiphany or spiritual awakening that is independent of religious doctrine or institutional faith. Stephen determines that he will pursue art and beauty as his religion, replacing conventional spirituality with aesthetic consciousness and creation. He becomes convinced that true freedom requires departing Ireland entirely, seeking exile in continental Europe, where he might develop his artistic identity. Stephen begins learning languages: French, German, Italian as preparation for his anticipated departure and as intellectual tools for his artistic development. He keeps a spiritual journal in which he records his thoughts, observations, and aesthetic theories, documenting his intellectual transformation. The journal reflects his growing sophistication and his determination to forge a new identity based on artistic rather than religious principles. Stephen experiences moments of doubt and uncertainty about whether his artistic calling is genuine or merely a romantic fantasy. Yet he remains committed to his vision of artistic freedom and individual autonomy, viewing this commitment as sacred and invincible. He consciously adopts the aesthetic theory that the artist must maintain detachment and observe experience without becoming emotionally entangled. Stephen sees his fellow students as trapped within conventional categories and unaware of the possibilities for individual transformation and growth. He views himself as uniquely sensitive, intellectually advanced, and capable of perceiving truths that ordinary people cannot comprehend or appreciate. This sense of special insight and superiority becomes intertwined with his artistic vocation and his determination to pursue excellence and beauty. Stephen recognizes that his intellectual pride and his sense of superiority may themselves constitute spiritual arrogance and moral failure. Yet he cannot abandon his conviction that authentic artistic creation requires such detachment and refusal of conventional moral judgment. James Joyce presents Stephen's consciousness with unprecedented psychological depth, capturing the texture of thought and perception with extraordinary subtlety. The novel demonstrates how personal development occurs through crisis, alienation, and the progressive rejection of received values and inherited traditions. Joyce portrays Stephen's artistic awakening as deeply connected to his sexual coming of age and his struggle with desire and physical passion. The work explores the tension between the individual's need for freedom and authentic self-expression and society's demands for conformity. Stephen Dedalus becomes a prototype for the modernist hero: sensitive, intellectually independent, artistically ambitious, and fundamentally alienated from society. A portrait of the artist as a young man represents one of literature's greatest explorations of consciousness, development, and artistic vocation. The novel affirms the necessity of individual freedom and authentic self-creation, even at the cost of exile and alienation from family and community. Joyce's masterpiece celebrates the power of art and aesthetic consciousness to transcend ordinary social reality and conventional moral frameworks. The work demonstrates how the individual consciousness can be represented with unprecedented psychological accuracy and philosophical depth in literary form. Stephen's journey from blind faith through intellectual doubt toward artistic autonomy remains eternally relevant to human development and individual transformation.